after 4 minutes. I'm very happy to be live today. It's our, I don't know, I think it's our 5th or 6th webinar, the first one of 2025. And today it's a topic I am particularly keen to talk about because it's both about RevOps, which is a bunch of people that we love at Hyperline, but it's also about a small duel, even though we say that it's a small duel between the US and Europe, which is, for people living in Europe right now, we've had a bunch of jokes about the European regulating while the US are innovating. So we are just going to see if it's the same about the RevOps community. Are we regulating while the US are innovating? Are we just learning from each other? So today I am joined with 3 great speakers. I'm going to try to introduce you guys. But don't hesitate, obviously, to mention anything that I'm gonna forget. I'm gonna start with you, Matt. Matt, you have actually built a community that's called RevOps Co, right? That you've co-founded. When was that?
That's right. That was a little over 4 years ago that we started the community, and I think it was actually shortly after starting the community that's when I first met Shantanu, way back in the day when he was on the RevOps team at Nitro.
Okay, that's a great transition because Shantanu, you are now a senior director of revenue operation at Personio. Is that right? The HR company.
That is correct. Thank you. And also one of the European unicorns, if I might call it that. Yeah, delighted to be here.
Still a European unicorn, despite the.
That is important. That is important.
That's very important. All right. So Personio, and so before that, you were I forgot the name of the company that Matt mentioned, but you've been doing operations your whole life. Is that it?
I've been in RevOps about 10 years plus now, and then in a past life I was a management consultant at Bain, but more recently I was at Gong, which I think a lot of your listeners might know. And then Matt, obviously, then was it 4 years ago when we connected in RevOps Co? 5 years ago now, it feels like. And before that, I spent a lot of time at LinkedIn. So pretty much been in SaaS RevOps for the last 10 years now.
You've been in B2B SaaS RevOps your whole life. So you're fitting perfectly on LinkedIn. And then Marcus, so you are not doing advisory, right? You're the founder of Revenue Operations Advisor. You're advising PE and VC backed high growth companies. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I've been doing that.
Cool. And you've been leading RevOps for various companies for like as long as RevOps has existed, actually, because it says to me that you started in 2006.
Yeah, another way of saying I'm quite old.
I was in primary school.
Yeah, no,
experienced, Marcus, not old.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we're looking forward to everything you have to teach us about all of these years of experience. So all of you, so I remember when we prepared that webinar, we mentioned a bunch of you had worked in the US. I can't remember, and I haven't taken note if all of you have worked in the US or if only some of you have worked in the US. So all of you have worked in the US?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. That's gonna be amazing. One thing I want to start with, and maybe I'm gonna start in the order. Matt, we can start with you. One thing that I want to start is there is an obvious, at least it's what it feels like from the outside. There is an obvious difference, first and foremost, in mindset between the US and Europe in every job. That's what it feels like from the outside. I'm curious to see. In RevOps in particular, I think we can give a very quick definition of RevOps while you're at it for the audience, even though I think everyone knows already what it is. Have you seen, over the course of your travels, have you seen a real difference in mindset between the US and Europe on revenue operations in general?
So on the definition side, I look at RevOps as essentially people process technology that spans the entire revenue engine from marketing to sales to customer success and post-sales. And I guess I haven't seen, to answer your second question on the differences, I don't know if it's a difference so much as I've seen, at least within the community, more of a delay, if you will, like things that are happening probably now and that maybe folks are experiencing as revenue operators in Europe are, I'll say, the same sort of things that were happening in the United States maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so it's not so much a difference as things are just, I don't know if exploding is the right word, but just kind of evolving and moving outside of the US into other areas across the globe.
Marcus, do you think, why do you think this happens? Because it doesn't feel like it's RevOps only. It feels like Europe tends to adopt things 2-3 years faster than the US, which may sound like a problem. At least to me, it may sound like a problem. It means American companies are moving faster. Something you've seen as well, like we tend to have innovation coming to Europe 2-3 years faster later.
It's interesting. So the yes and no. I would say there is a delay, but if you just look at the demographics, I mean, you just find a much larger ecosystem of venture capital funded startups, especially in the SaaS space in the US. And those are the companies that usually look at, as they scale, how to add, I would say, actually some method to the madness that high growth means, right? And then you start looking at processes. Start looking at how do we really use this thing that's called CRM in the right way. You're looking at how do we grow and set up scalable motion. So that is all associated to high growth, and you just simply find more high growth companies in the US. As we look at how it's adopted, every company needs to find their operational excellence driver as the companies, stands for different markets, different products, different motions. I think that's where RevOps is adopted in a very similar way, because you have to do the basics, as Matt was saying, right? People, process, technology. I would add to that data, right? And let's not forget the fundamental thing, which is the strategy. So if you have those 5 things and you have good answers to that, then you can start rolling with RevOps, independently on whether you are on this side or the other side of the pond.
Yeah, I think because it feels like at the beginning when you start, maybe Shantanu, you're going to have something to say on that front, but It feels like at the beginning when you start, Marcus, you've been here for a while. So you've seen RevOps starting, basically. At the beginning when you start, I would expect indeed to have like high growth company, high efficiency company to sort of need more and so invest more. And so people would improve. But then over time, I see any improvement is going to plateau at some point. Obviously, maybe AI is going to change that, and that's something we can mention later. But something is going to plateau. Shantanu, do you think there is a sort of RevOps excellence right now that we can see across the US and Europe? Like, do you feel the best companies from Europe? For instance, I can mention like Intercom, which is a European company, feels to be excellent to me in many ways of what they do. Do you think now excellent companies are on par? And then we can translate to what they do, because that's an interesting bit. But like, do you think they're on par?
I think it's a great example, and I would like to hope Personio is getting there as well. So I do think, and you mentioned Intercom. In fact, hopefully, the head of go-to-market ops, an old colleague of mine, Tyler, hopefully he's watching as well. But if I think about that entire RevOps excellence and the evolution that both Matt and Marcus talked about as well, there's really 2 types of companies in which you can be working on in Europe if you're in RevOps. And that's where the distinction to me is very clear. Because you could be in a US headquartered company and working for the European arm of that company, which I think, by the way, is a lot of RevOps roles here as well. Or you could be in a pure play European company. You mentioned Intercom obviously has a massive American presence now. There are companies like Stripe started from Ireland, moved there as well. So I think if you look at these 2 buckets, I think the ones which are, and I spend a lot of time on the first leg first, and now I'm in a European headquartered, European centered company. I think in the first one, quite often you're trying to balance how much you are trying to incubate from the region, but also there's a lot of centralized decision making, and it became even more accelerated with COVID and how the entire industry has evolved in SaaS. On a pure RevOps in Europe, headquartered here, the second bucket, I think that's where, and that's the evolution, Matt and Marcus. I love the 5 elements they talked about. On all of those fronts, I think we've started moving a lot closer. And again, with AI coming into the picture, like you said, it's probably going to be, that gap will get shortened quicker. So I'm excited about that.
Because so one thing, I don't know who mentioned it during our preparation, but one person during the preparation mentioned the fact that most RevOps in Europe, or a lot of RevOps in Europe in high-performing companies, are actually European RevOps from American companies. Like you have an American company that's established in Europe for whatever reason. And so these RevOps technically, so for instance, I'm a French RevOps. I'm going to work in France, and then I'm going to be hired by Facebook or whoever has a good RevOps function in Europe. And then I'm going to go to a European company. So technically, this should spread naturally, like good practice and tools. And questions are coming to my mind now, but maybe Matt, on your side, technically speaking, what are the differences? like what makes a good RevOps in the US that's coming 3 years later in Europe? Like what are the kind of things, really concrete things that are different, that are late, if I may?
Well, I think so to me, I guess the core, call it functions, the talent you need to be a revenue operator. Like my initial reaction is there is no difference, right? Like if you're in RevOps at a high growth company, like the things that there's a core set of stuff that you're going to be needing to do. One of those is, like basically be comfortable with the fact that you will get new things, new problems thrown at you every day, every week that you've never experienced before. And your initial reaction is to kind of dive headfirst and tackle those problems. But I'll backtrack on that a little bit because there are obviously big cultural differences to working and navigating companies in different parts of the globe. And I think actually like Marcus and Shantanu are probably well suited to talk about what some of those differences are, because I can imagine some of the stuff that I've probably done and pulled would simply not fly if I was, say, in Shantanu's position. And same thing, like,
Shantanu agrees.
yeah, and some stuff, would probably, I'll say, maybe move, I don't know, too slow or maybe not fast enough here, like things that I wanted right now, that would maybe be like the preferred or the right way to do things if I was operating within a company based in Europe, or I should say just outside of the United States.
Shantanu, you were nodding.
No, great. I think it's interesting. I think, and I think the part where it becomes very tricky, right? Because if you're in, again, and we're talking about Europe as one market, there's so many different flavors, and and not to go to, and I won't say to TikTok for our American friends, but not to go to all the all the memes we have on how Europe is not a country, but there's so many different flavors, right? So Lucas, you mentioned, for example, in France, the way you would implement something is so different from the way you might implement something in Germany versus UK and Ireland. And again, UK and Ireland, 2 different markets. So there's just such a vast number of countries and different mindsets that you need to take into consideration. So if you combine that with some of the challenges you might find, for example, data quality. Actually, in fact, just today, I spent some time thinking about how do we think about our database, right? You have your CRM set up, and I think Matt mentioned that example as a good one. How you would think about buying your data enrichment tools, what you bring in for
like
American
GDPR, for
so
instance,
GDPR
like European regulations.
Exactly, it is so unique. So it's important to go into that, I'd say.
Yeah, and I would add, great points. I would add the aside from the geographical complexity that Europe means, so many different languages, right? If you just think about the enablement piece, if you want to enable a team across Europe, you have to either standardize on English as being the standard language, or you have to add language components to that. Aside from that, what I also noticed is from an approach perspective, and it goes beyond RevOps actually. But in the US, I've worked there for 15 years, and don't want to miss a minute. It was fantastic, the time that we spent in Seattle. It's more entrepreneurial. It's more focused on let's get that solution quick. And in RevOps, you are in the middle. In a high growth company, you're in that whirlwind, right? A lot of things happen, and you're looked at as the chief problem solver, right? Hey, can we launch a new product? Can we expand into that geography? Can we add that new partner motion? Can we start a new rule set to validate and convert MQLs to SQLs? Whatever it is, there's I think a stronger rhythm of internal company-specific innovation that RevOps is tasked to handle, just because the businesses in the US, they're more focused on let's solution this quick, and let's worry about the risks and what it really means operationally later.
So let me rephrase that. What you mean is, in Europe, we are more focused in the end on the process and making sure things are done right, whereas in the US, we are more focused on moving forward. That's a bit what you mean on the RevOps side.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far. So there's always, by the way, a good RevOps lead, and there was a great question in the the chat here, what is good RevOps? Good RevOps leader focuses on doing things the right way and getting things right, no matter where you are, right? That's basically a global topic, right? But in Europe, my experience is that there is definitely a higher aversion to risk. So you spend more time analyzing and problem solving by looking at simply more angles, and that as a result, it takes a little longer, but you have just more risk aspects covered. So the so what question or the what if question is something that, in my experience, is looked at with more intensity in Europe. On the other side, it takes longer, right? So you need to basically balance the trade-off there.
Yeah, because it feels like there are basically RevOps in Europe are evolving within more constraints. So they have to deal with constraint over time. We mentioned the localization. Bastien, I think, is from Swan, mentioned that they have to deal with like localization. If you sell things like bank, accounting, finance, you have to, I know I've translated so many products. You need to translate the products, and you have to deal with GDPR as well. And it's part of the growth team and part of the ops team, but it's still you have to deal with it, right? And it feels like Americans are way less, their hands are way more free. So they can go faster at solutions because also they don't have these constraints. And so if you take an American RevOps, for instance, and you put them directly into Europe, they may struggle as well, just because like there are so many things that they could do in the US that they cannot do in Europe. Matt, is this something that rings a bell to you? Is it something that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to what Shantanu and Marcus had already mentioned with like constraints and things that like they've seen or dealt with firsthand. And like the enablement one is a good one. I think like some of those differences, like I look at, and like the language thing, right? Like those exist, I think, probably like across roles, like outside, those aren't unique to RevOps, right? And so I think some of these differences and things that we're talking about, we're looking at through a RevOps lens, because that's why we're all here today. But they're not unique, I'll say, to RevOps. Like a lot of these are more differences between working just on either side of the pond, if you will.
I'm reading at the same time the comment from Catherine, which is really interesting. Which is she asks how a European RevOps would catch up to the US. But more than that, this basically is a very good transition to the discussion we wanted to have on hiring and talent availabilities. So I think the question from Catherine that we can answer first, maybe Shantanu, you can take this one. But she says, what do you recommend to catch up to the pace of RevOps in the US and get ahead in your career on a global level, given the cultural differences? How much should we basically try to follow US trends? And I think the question extends to like, can we follow US trends because of all the regulations and constraints that we have in Europe? Can we, or do we just need to build a different RevOps muscle? Like, do we need to learn from the US, or do we need to build different?
I think the answer, like most excellent answers, probably is it depends. It depends on the company you're in. It always depends, right? That's what I did before I went to RevOps. I learned, but it depends on the company you're in. I'll go back to that difference of, is it an American company with a European headquarter, or a European company operating purely in Europe? And again, also depends on the size of the company. But essentially, I think a lot of the concepts are quite translatable, right? If you think about all the best practices, shout out to some of the great stuff that Matt has on RevOps Co, right? Even there, most of those practices you've seen would apply, but you'd have to start applying almost like a dressing before you translate this into Europe. And I'll give you an example. I think, especially as we're all thinking about overall cost of acquisition, lifetime value, and how we're thinking about the entire operating model across different segments, I'm sure several of our listeners might be thinking about, what do I do about this certain sub-segment? Even if you're a mid-market or a commercial SaaS product, there's a certain threshold below which your company is not making money selling to a certain customer
Unfortunately.
size. Unfortunately. So how do you think about that almost operating model in terms of the team which engages, whether it's the customer facing team, the actual overall operating model? Quite often in America, as you set up, the scale is so different. You could set up and I'll give you a CSM or an account manager with, say, 500 plus accounts in a certain segment. And we had the same learning when we were trying to adapt this into our European offices, because we had to look at German customers, French customers. Each of them had language nuances. So how do you do that? How to look at different Dutch. So as you start building that out, yes, you should bring in those learnings from what our American friends have done across the pond, but then start thinking about the context for us here. Now, on the flip side, maybe the cost per head is not as much as it might be in the US. So you try and balance there. So I would say
you
a
can
bit of
get a US person to work in Europe for cheap.
Yes.
that's the thing. Marcus, that makes me think about something. It's like when I'm hiring sales, I think it's similar. When I'm hiring sales, I'm always I try to avoid hiring sales from like Stripe or Notion, because I've seen like American companies, when they come into Europe, the sales that they hire are guys that are paid to replicate the US playbook. They adjust it a little bit, but usually they are hired to replicate the US playbook. And basically, they have a lot of inbound and have a lot of things that they can work on top of. And I've seen like European companies usually have sales that have been more on the ground. They've seen what it is to sell to a German CFO, and it's not the same as selling to an American RevOps, right? Is it, you've managed teams your whole career in RevOps? Is it something that you looked at when you were hiring people? Like, have they worked for a US company and a European company in both continents? Like, is it something you looked at or not at all?
No, absolutely. It's actually a great point. I always say that in RevOps, as a leader or as a team, you're only as good as the perception that exists about you and the team in the go-to-market organization. Perceptions are everything. And how do you drive a good perception? By really being in the business versus on the business. And that's actually one of the answers to Catherine's question, right? You want to really be in the business, meaning understanding how decisions are made. What are the points of persuasion? What are the value perceptions in the target market? Is the ICP well defined? And that's different. There's differences in how that's defined, Europe versus the US. And if, as you hire for your RevOps team, you want to hire people that actually think and act and understand how the go-to-market motion works. Yes, you're going to hire some specialists on the data, on the CRM side, technical specialists, but you need to basically be able to have them in a room with sellers and then being able to speak one language, although there are different roles. And that is something that you need to recognize as you build a team, or even from the ground up, right? If you go, let's assume that your seed is, you have a CRM system, and someone starts to ask the question, how do we use that thing sensibly and reasonably? Which is usually a starting point to start thinking about ops and RevOps and so on. Well, ask that question in the context of how do we create delightful experiences to our users? And that is a cultural question, because people come from different backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
And to your point about in Europe, there are certain markets and companies where also tenures are much longer, and people don't change jobs that quickly.
Which
it's another
in Europe?
to take into account. Yeah, Europe, right?
In Europe,
because
yeah.
And from a company perspective, it's much more difficult to hire. It takes longer because people just take longer to get out of a job. So you need to plan it with different frameworks, different parameters. That translates into an additional complication in Europe when you do pure capacity planning. You just need to think differently in terms of how long does it take to hire that person? How long does it take to hire and onboard that person? And add those flexibility buffers into any plan. It's more difficult in Europe than in the US.
I'm gonna try to answer the questions at the same time, because we have some. They may be a bit different from what we're talking about right now, but I'm gonna try to fall back onto something that we decided we'd talk about. One person is, I mean, it goes with talent, right? But one person, Robert, was asking about the reporting structure. Trying to have that question answered in the context of the US versus Europe. Have you seen? I'm gonna try to do it always same direction. So I'm gonna go to Matt now. But reporting structure, where should RevOps sit in an organization? That's a question we've had at Hyperline as well. Like sales, finance, revenue, CEO, whatever. Where should it sit? And is it different between the US and Europe? Have you seen different things and different culture?
So two things. One, I guess I'll let Shantanu and Marcus answer the question of if or is it different. But my point of view in terms of reporting structure is, again, in an ideal world, RevOps reports up through a CRO, someone who is actually a CRO, though, not like a glorified head of sales. So chief revenue officer or a chief operating officer. Someone who's responsible for revenue or what's best for the business. RevOps does not and should not report up to, again, this is default to like a functional head, like the head of marketing, or the head of sales or the head of CS, because if you're RevOps and you report up to the head of marketing, at the end of the day, you are marketing ops, because that person is ultimately going to prioritize things that are relevant and important to them, not things that are relevant or important to other people on the team, even though at the end of the day, everybody wants what's best for the business. The caveat there is, one, I understand nothing in life is 100% true or certain. So you may very well be able to have structures that go against something that I just said, but that's not going to be the norm,
Debate,
or it's not going to be like the average. And then the last thing I want to add before throwing it over to Shantanu and Marcus is just, with all of these, call it trends or things that we're talking about, like differences between the US and Europe, like it's easy to be like, oh, well, we're in Europe, let's do this thing because that's what like the US has did and it worked. Again, like always start with the problem that you're trying to solve and then look at the solution you can apply to solve that problem. And learnings from what operators within the US are one piece of that puzzle in terms of solutions that you can apply to a problem. But again, it may not work because of the same thing that you mentioned before, Lucas, of, like, hey, salespeople in maybe the US were used to performing under different circumstances than, sales folks who were within the EU or elsewhere. So again, like, don't just assume that because it's something that you've seen in the US and has been successful, that you can just apply that to your current org or structure within the EU. Think through, again, problem first, then solution, not the other way around. But I'll let Shantanu kind of add to that on.
I was gonna say, seems something you cannot disagree on, Shantanu, because he said you find the problem and then you fix the problem, which
problem
feels like
solving
something we will agree on. But
exactly.
Anything you disagree with in what he said?
No,
anything
I
that you
think,
don't
I,
fully
think
agree
I
on?
would say yes, and big plus one to what Matt said. I think completely agree on that. In fact, I'll now start quoting Marcus on being in the business. I love that, being in the business or on the business. So I think there's a lot of value from being in the business. And again, if I put that lens of, if you're in a European arm of an American company in RevOps versus even in Europe, it is ideal if you're sitting somewhere where you have a full view of what's happening, because if you don't, you're restricted to a certain silo, and the power of RevOps is you're getting a broader picture. But there's a software element as well to it, because if I think about this market, and again, I'm very certain that RevOps in Europe will also blow up. As we think about where the RevOps team or person or people, depending on how big your org is, it's important to make sure that the RevOps people feel part of a community in some way as well. So again, while there could be opportunities to have them in different functions, the value of being in the core piece of the, let's say, the leadership team of the CRO, or even if it's the leadership team of finance, either way, to be honest, I think to me is fine. But they need to be there with hopefully a path to having a seat at the table, so that one, your RevOps leaders or team is able to find the problems that you mentioned and able to drive strategies towards it. Second, when you go back to being in the European headquarters for an American company, and I think a lot of our European RevOps folks are there, you do want to be able to have clear delineation between who your stakeholder is versus who your functional leader is. And I think quite often, and I know Marcus has done this as well, where you've been the global head of RevOps somewhere else, but you have European RevOps teams who might be sometimes struggling to be, I would say, impartial or objective about what's right and wrong for Europe.
Technically, they're supposed to be closer from the European guys than from whoever is the head of RevOps in the US, because the context is the local one, and there should be a priority. Marcus, it's something you've seen, right?
Yeah, so I would add the unpopular opinion that the reporting line doesn't matter. And here's why I say this.
We love unpopular opinions. We do shorts with them, and then we push you.
Unpopular, right? Here's why. So there are so many more things that are important to ensure that RevOps impacts the company and the go-to-market motion that you're working with than the reporting line. For example, the roadmap. You need to have a clear charter, and you need to really formulate well why you do the things that you will do as a team, and how does it link to company objectives, go-to-market objectives. The functional alignment between accountabilities and responsibilities, and also delineating the hub and spoke model, because RevOps should be that linking, that glue that brings all the different go-to-market motions together. And defining that and building a work plan, a roadmap around that is far more important than the reporting line. The reporting line could be, and I've worked in my career twice for CFOs, and both have been wonderful experiences. I've worked for a CRO and a COO and a CEO. So I've seen it all, and it always works, because the most important thing is to establish the charter and actually also be good. And that's something that there are some questions about, what can we learn from the US? Here's a point that we can certainly learn in Europe. In the US, it's more about selling and also extending to internal selling. And as a RevOps leader, especially in a new motion, in a younger company, you need to sell internally. Why would people even care about go-to-market efficiency, operational efficiency? Now, that's a little bit easier since 22, because now everything is about reasonable and efficient growth. And the times of crazy, just looking at the top line and ARR growth are over, thankfully. But still, you need to establish your reason of being in the company that you're working with. And that's something that in the US happens much more naturally, because people are just, more focused on selling also internally. Definitely something to look at. So rather than reporting line, which, by the way, each company needs to define that. And it makes sense, for example, if you report as a RevOps team into a very business savvy and business aligned CFO, that might be the best reporting line for your particular situation. So each company needs to find that out, and by looking at the relative importance and the impact points that RevOps should drive.
So it's the reason why I disagree with that, though, Marcus, and why I think reporting line does matter is because think of all the conversations that happen while you're not in the room. And if you do not report to the right person, all of those, and they don't have the influence, they're not able to do the selling to, the other stakeholders that you just mentioned are so important. Like, you're not going to be able to be in all of those conversations. And so if you don't report to the right person, then there's a lot of stuff that's going to be happening when you're not in the room that are going to impact your ability to do and execute on all of those things that you just mentioned. And I know that when it comes to reporting line, and same thing with titles, I know that like initial reactions are like, hey, like, shouldn't matter, seems silly, right? But what if, like, Shantanu, what if I all of a sudden told you you're not a senior director anymore, you're just you're manager, and your job title is not RevOps, it's ops. Yeah. And like, so those things do matter for optics, right? All the reasons that we kind of have talked about optics. So that's why I guess I disagree with the unpopular opinion. And I think that reporting line and title do matter for those reasons.
Yeah, just to add, Matt, just to clarify, when I worked for CFOs, guess who I spent most of the time with? The CRO and the respective sales leaders. Of course, that's what you need to do in order to be relevant in the role. So
100%. And that is, I think, one of those, like, we were talking about, again, skill sets or things that I think like folks can learn. And maybe that is one of those things for, like, between the US and Europe, right? Like, kind of, I don't know if force is the right word, but like that internal selling, right? Like, you are like, you are your advocate, like, no one's going to hand you anything, right? Like, you got to go out and like get the things done. And so, like, that may mean like force yourself into the room, right? Like, get into those conversations. No one's going to hand you that. And if you have that mentality, I think you'll be successful in RevOps. But who you report to will help you and can make your life easier as well.
Yeah. I think in the end, if we look at it, RevOps are dealing with so many stakeholders that are coming from so many different, and we see it in billing. Like, in billing, you have to deal with finance, sales, and customer success, and engineering. And I think RevOps in the end have to become specialists of dealing with various stakeholders and knowing how to talk to head of sales and knowing how to talk to the CFO And yes, the CFO is controlling risk, so you need to bring him risk control, but then the head of sales is controlling sales. So you need to bring them more efficiency, more return on investment, lower cost, that sort of things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's interesting that you guys have the debate on that, because it shows how much it is important that you do the stakeholder management thing, which makes me have one question on my hand. And because I am presenting, I have priority over the chat. But Shantanu, I'm going to ask you that question because you haven't spoken for a long time. How much, I mean, as a French person, I am really bad at corporate politics. I am really bad. It just doesn't work for me. That's not how we French do things. I know in the US, I wouldn't say they're good at politics, but they are definitely very good at feeling very engaged with someone, and at showing interest into everything, even if it's not interesting to them, and at managing that sort of relationship with key stakeholders. And they can be friends with everyone without it, but like it works. Is it something that you've seen the US RevOps being better than European ones? The sort of being in a good term with every stakeholder in the organization and working productively with them rather than European ones who are sort of more frontal?
So I would say to an extent, I do believe this is agnostic of whether you're in US or Europe, because I think I've seen good examples of this in the US. I've seen good examples of this in Europe, and I've seen both. And I'll almost take this back to one of the questions that Catherine asked and connect that with this, Lucas, which is, to me, a good RevOps professional does three things well. Problem solving, which is what we talked about, literally problem solving, thought leadership, tackling the big challenges. Second, driving process around pieces that we're solving for. But the third part on people and that stakeholder engagement broader across the team. And unfortunately or fortunately, 80% of our work is based on that third leg. The first two, like any project we're working on, any big change we're making, we can drive the best solution, but unless we can make it land and have that connections with the people, it doesn't land. So to your point, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily easier in Europe versus the US. It's probably, I would say, similar depending on the people you're working with. But I think people in the US find, or at least come across as more effortless on that. I think in Europe, what I've seen we've had to, let's say, train people more on this, because if you are coming in from, and again, there's an element of a large volume of people having done RevOps already in the US have probably gone through that process. In Europe, quite often you might be in your first or second RevOps job where you're trying to drive this. So I do think there's that difference, but I've seen good examples on both sides.
I think one question that I've seen on the chat that's sort of related and unrelated, but it's about the career progression opportunities and just generally understanding the value of RevOps. That's a question from Tom. I remember that we discussed during the preparation the recognition of the function, like how much the function is recognized. Is it like a support function that's sort of dismissed by everyone as, please do that analysis for me? Or is it I'm not going to say strategic function because the RevOps here are just going to kill me if I say that, but like, is it more a function that should have a word to say in improving everything? And my question is not there, because we all will agree that the RevOps function is very important, like any support function in general. But the interesting thing is how valued is it? Like, is it a career in Europe especially, but also in the US, that can take you very far? Is it something that's valued socially in the startup ecosystem in general, especially now with the AI coming in, doing a lot of the data cleaning and CRM management job probably in 5 years? Maybe I can hand it over to Marcus to change. But Marcus, do you think it's something that's like recognized enough, and that's, if you were starting today, is it a good career decision to go into RevOps given the way things are evolving?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a little bit biased. I've built my career in RevOps, so it's definitely a good decision. And actually, to your point, 5 years, I actually think 5 months, right? So you need to be really on top of things. And this, here's where things are similar between EMEA and US. You have to find the reason of being and basically connect it to the company objectives, and then having a value story that is very clearly and well understood, a team and organizational charter. If your company uses OKRs, make sure that you're connected to the OKRs and that your team drives measurable outcomes. That's very important. And there are a couple of things where you really want to make sure, and this is exactly the same, no matter where on the globe the RevOps function exists, that you want to make sure that you're really seen as a partner in steering and running the business, and not just like, oh, a bunch of CRM admins or, oh, report builders and so on, right? That's also what we do operationally, but the why we do it. So you connect that to the overlying assumption that we want to add value to the go-to-market motion in the company. And that is very important. As for where I see differences, there's definitely, if you look at the talent pool, a huge difference between EMEA and the US, right? In the US, because of the larger amount of companies that do invest in operational efficiency and go-to-market efficiency, there's just a larger talent pool. So it's easier to find people who have done this and who can basically add value. In Europe, that's the challenge right now. There are so many roles available. And that, again, back to your question, does it make sense to build a career? Of course, there's an opportunity to join fantastic companies, private equity backed, venture capital funded, where there's a huge understanding of why operational efficiency in the go-to-market space is an essential growth and value driver. And if you find that environment, then basically, and you are, of course, a good to great RevOps kind of person that then moves things forward and is constantly in the business versus on the business and so on, and then there is no limits in regards of the career progression. I would even go as far as, and I've seen some cases where actually new CRO roles are filled with people that have built their experience in operational leadership roles.
I'm not surprised. You said something really interesting at the beginning. You said, as a RevOps, you need to be sure to be included in these sort of OKRs things, not as only the person running the OKRs, but also as responsible for KPIs and things to track. Matt, I'm going to ask you a very simple question, but it may be hard to answer. As a RevOps, how do you market yourself? Like, how do you create that sort of image in the company where you're respected for more of the support function? What's the tips? It's very actionable, but like, what are the tips to create a good image of yourself?
Yeah, well, for goal setting, so one, OKRs are near and dear to my heart because I used to work for an OKR software company and we still run OKRs. But I think to, I guess, go with what Marcus was saying, like hold yourself, like align the things that you do and are responsible for to those goals, objectives that the company or those various teams have, right? So if it's, you want to generate X number of new business dollars this quarter, drive Y dollar of expansion revenue, decrease customer acquisition costs to a certain level, right? Like put together your goals and your objectives to align directly with those things. And I'll say, like, do the math to make it clear how your work impacts stuff and think about things through that lens. So talking about some of those operational things before, right? If it's, say you're building a new integration, or you're deploying some new technology, one, your goal could be, deploy technology X and, get it live by a certain date, right? But that doesn't indicate to anybody how that's actually delivering value for, for your sales team, right?
Yeah,
so instead, so reframe it through the outcome, right? Like, deploy tool X to save sales reps on average 30 minutes a day, right? Or whatever it
and
is,
track
right?
the
Like
outcome.
And so things like that, like when you reframe them through not like what you're doing, but the outcome that you're going to drive, then it becomes very clear the value, the quote unquote value that you're delivering, which is not just a report or a new tool that's now getting implemented, but it's the outcome that's getting delivered. And the last thing I'll mention is careers in RevOps, stuff around like AI and new technology. I think like revenue operators are uniquely positioned to be at the center of all of that, right? Like if you look at the people, the process, the technology, everything that's driving revenue efficiently and effectively for your company, from marketing to sales to post-sales and back through this flywheel, nothing that's linear. Like RevOps is at the center of that, right? Like they're able to see the people, the process, and the tech and how those things all align to generate the financial outcomes that ultimately get represented on your income statement as revenue, which is the thing that, everyone kind of cares about. So if you're looking at how to apply AI to do anything that's related to marketing, sales, or post-sales and drive revenue, to me, there's no better person or team that should be responsible for that than your RevOps team.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned AI, which is really interesting. I have to. I'm sorry, but Shantanu, I'm curious because we've seen that sort of AI model stuff, and we've seen what Europe is doing right now, which is like we have Mistral in France, but I like what they do and everything. It's just right now it's nowhere close from OpenAI in terms of like size and everything, and even DeepSeek has been dwarfing everyone recently. It seems like in Europe we don't have intelligence on iPhones because because of the regulations, whatever. I'm not exactly sure. With AI coming up, do you think the fact that Europe doesn't allow as many things as the US, like especially on data processing and all of that. So we're not going to be able to sort of throw a bunch of data into an AI chatbot and then have it work for us. Do you think this is going to extend the difference between the US and Europe, and that we should maybe not regulate as much if we want to keep being competitive on that side? Yes, it's a political question. Yes,
I have to take a stance on that, but I think I actually believe AI will help close that gap. To be honest. Because if anything, AI to me will help move most industries much faster on the maturity curve. And what I mean by that is, if I think of RevOps as an industry, as a function, right? And if I think US is probably in a very mature stage, it's a relative term compared to Europe. I think AI will help us leapfrog that, because a lot of things which US learned or our US RevOps friends learned through almost, I would say, brute force, and having to do it in a certain way. Right now, ChatGPT is my best friend, but also in terms of SaaS AI tools, I've started looking, like we've actually been looking at quite a few. I won't name drop any because I don't want them to start calling me, but we've been looking at a few and trying to figure out which one do we use, whether it's for data enrichment, whether it's for actual the engagement on the sales side on sales outreach, or if I even think about everything to do with productivity, because it all goes back to, at the core, if the revenue or go-to-market team you're working with is successful, then your RevOps team is successful. And a big driver of that right now we're trying to do is, how do you not only think about efficient growth in itself, but how do you drive productivity and give time back to the owners? And that's where AI is probably going to be RevOps' best friend. And I think as we see a lot of new technology coming in, I've deliberately not taken a political stance on how Europe will fare versus not, but
yeah,
I do think we have.
I'll hand it over to Marcus. Don't worry.
We have an opportunity to use AI to bring that much quicker together. Yeah.
Marcus, what do you think? Will Europe lose on the AI RevOps war?
No, absolutely not. I think, +1 to everything Matt and Shantanu said. I would add, it's about use cases, right? And no team, no function better than to understand what use cases are really the higher leverage opportunities to use and start with AI. And I think where we can learn from the US is just get going, start, don't overthink, right? There is you don't need a fully baked plan in order to start experimenting on a use case, because the technology and the capabilities and the possibilities move so fast. Before you know it, you have to start somewhere. So that's there's an opportunity where I don't see, by the way, a difference between Europe and the US. It's more on RevOps. It behooves the RevOps function to really get active and determine what use cases make sense. Now, of course, you're right, Lucas. There are differences. If you just look at anything associated to GDPR, you need to take that into account. Yeah. That doesn't take away that there are many opportunities to add value to processes overall, take times out, simplify, and finding those, there's no function better position than RevOps, and that's a big opportunity. Also, back to your earlier point about building a career. If you want to build your career, get acquainted with what goes on, what's possible in AI, and focus on making a difference there, because that's going to be a difference maker for sure.
I would expect for sure. How much of a difference? That's what we don't know yet, especially in tooling. Like RevOps are using a lot of tools, but you don't know. Are tools going to have an interface tomorrow? You're not sure anymore. It's 23 already. I'm going to get the questions from the chat because we've just pushed them back. So Matt, I'm going to give one to you, and it's going to be a random one. But I think there's another question on reporting structure, which is, what's your typical reporting structure in the US in RevOps? Like, do you have a VP of RevOps or whatever the title, but do you have someone managing RevOps as a function? At what stage of company do you bring that person in? Or you just have RevOps reporting into any of the function? Because we talked earlier about any of the function is fine as long as you know how to adapt. So Matt, what's the typical structure? I think the question was about the US specifically, but like, what's the typical RevOps structure at different stage?
Yeah. So background here is, thinking more about earlier growth stage, kind of mid-market sort of companies that might be venture backed, typically working, in technology software. Those sort of companies, typically see, RevOps managers, then directors of revenue operations, then VPs of revenue operations. As companies get larger in size and maybe more mature, start to see, SVP of revenue operations. And that's kind of like, I'll say like the highest like RevOps sort of title that I've been seeing here in the United States. And then again, we talked a little bit about who those folks report into. Marcus mentioned, right, like a variety of different places, all of which have worked. I think all of which have worked with one common, the common thing is like why they have worked. But that's kind of what I've seen, at least within the US. And I think, Shantanu, that's probably maybe a little bit different for, I know like you've been at Gong and like other companies, right, that have had RevOps throughout different regions and countries, where what I think like you guys were probably reporting up to one common RevOps person, and then they reported into someone more at the corporate level.
Yeah, I think there's always, and this is where it's interesting, right? Going back to being in the business or not. I think quite often we've had, so when I was at Gong, I started off reporting into the international head, who was not RevOps, but international, like an MD of sorts, almost like a CRO for international. But I've been in a previous role at LinkedIn where I would report into the ops line, which is almost like a separate track from the revenue line, which I think there's value in both. But I think if I go purely within European RevOps function, I think depending on the team, again, depending on the size of the team and the size of the company, I would like to think, and I do think, I agree with Matt that it does matter where you are, so you get a seat at the table. So long as you are at the seat at the table where decisions are made, I honestly don't care about what the title is. So that's the most important.
So at what, it's interesting, Marcus, at what level, because you've been in that seat, right? At what, because the seat being at the table, there are, as we know, as company grow, there are multiple table. I remember my last company, we moved from like 100, like it was 5 and then 100 and then 500. And then at each of the stages, the table changes, right? And people change at that table. What table are we talking about? Like for growth stage companies like Series A, Series B, and then way above that, what table are we talking about? Like, should RevOps be sitting with the big guns, like CEOs, CROs? Do you think they have a word to say in that, and they should be there and it has value? Or do you think they should sit at the, what we typically call sort of the second level leadership line, which like all the
kids
directors
table
of engineering, the kids table? Yeah, you can call it that way.
Yeah, Lucas, great question. Definitely the former, right? So you want to, it's actually, I would recommend anyone thinking about taking on a RevOps role to make that part of their due diligence about the company and the role. You want to be having a seat at the table. Now, a lot of that will be earned as you execute and roll and you build the story around your team, right? But you want to find a setup where revenue operations is seen as a core element of go-to-market success and not just an afterthought or a side thing that, oh yeah, we need to pull some reports, we need to manage that stupid CRM thing. If you hear anything of that, then you have a value perception problem, which if you move into that role, you know what you need to focus on, which is kind of moving that perception into a totally different layer. So you definitely want to be seen as the organization that helps steer the business, that looks ahead of the business. A lot of sales and customer success leaders spend too much time looking back. RevOps is the team that can add value by looking into the future and seeing, okay, what are we seeing in regards to where the business is going? That's one of the key value drivers. And you want to be having that seat at the table where you can, Your voice is listened to. You, of course, need to be analytically strong to be able to give the insights, and then help with decision making, which is also a key value driver.
Yeah, you need to keep your seat. It's good to have it, but you need to keep your seat as well.
Oh yeah, and sometimes it's a hot seat, so you need to get used to that too.
I agree.
If I had a point on that, sorry for interrupting. I think I do think what Marcus said is so important, because I've spoken to a lot of RevOps people who've joined a company which did not understand the value of having RevOps at the table. And I'll give you a very, very concrete example, right? A good example, hopefully. So I've been 6 months now at Personio. I work directly with the chief revenue officer, reporting to him. And Matt, he's a proper CRO, not a glorified head of sales. And it's like two very simple examples where being at the table helped you. So he's made it a point where I'm in the room for most of these important conversations. One is, we just went through a planning cycle. Like I'm sure most of our listeners have gone through a planning cycle right now. Literally how we think about everything from, if I almost break down the ARR plan into different segments of almost like a driver tree and bring that together, we've literally set that up. And now we are driving that number across the company. Second, we're also driving an entire lead to cash project across the team right now. So we're overhauling a lot of processes, systems. We're Series F, so kind of a big company. So trying to overhaul all of that requires a significant investment. There was a conversation which had started before we had joined about potentially hiring more people to do it. But because I got involved in the conversation early on, we basically said, you know what, we need a consultant to come in and help fix this. So it's just having those small, very tangible examples, but the impact that it can have on the overall revenue org, as well as the brand of RevOps in the company, as well as your own experience. Yeah. It's so crucial to have that conversation early on with the hiring manager about how do they perceive RevOps.
Actually, the interesting thing that you said made me think that the most important conversation is maybe not the one you have at the meeting, but then at the end of the meeting, when you are, getting out of the room with the head of sales or whatever, and you're chatting with them. That may be the most important conversation. Sure. Matt, last one. Do you have anything to add on that specific topic? Because it's 31 already, so we're gonna have to cut. But do you want to add something on that topic?
Marcus and Shantanu said enough smart things. So
it's great. You guys seems to agree a lot. I think you should start a consulting practice together.
There you go, Marcus. Let us in on the action, man.
I've dropped that. All right, guys. Well, thank you. This was a very interesting hour. Thank you for the chat, for the questions as well, and everyone who listened. We will obviously have the replay available and short versions of unpopular opinions available as well. Thank you to everyone. As I didn't mention it at the beginning, but obviously we are Hyperline, a quote-to-cash company. I don't advertise that too much. But if you have billing issues, quote issues, product catalogs issues, or reporting issues, then you're fine to check our website. That's hyperline.co. And of course, for all of your customers, guys, same thing. Don't hesitate. We work all across the world, US or Europe. We don't differentiate, right? So thank you so much, guys, for being here with me today. And I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Bye.